Hello and welcome to another character analysis from the Endwalker main cast. Since Y'shtola got a lot of focus in the most recent patch, I figured it would be best to talk about her next. Being exceedingly clever, well versed in arcane and ancient wisdom, being the student of the legendary Archon Matoya, as well as sporting a badass mage aesthetic post-Shadowbringers through a deadly combination of the elements that forms her destructive sorcery, Y'shtola is a mage in the truest sense of the word. She's also the avatar of destruction, named so for her ability to obliterate sons of the tiny variety. Now, when we talk about Y'shtola, the very first thing I want to discuss is a common scenario that happens whenever I discuss the characters of this game with my friends. We'd be talking about our favorite characters, and then Y'shtola is either completely forgotten about, or she gets brought up as a, oh yeah, she's my least favorite of the bunch, or something to that effect, which often gets followed by reasons such as, I never really felt emotional in any of her scenes, I hate the fake out death scenes, she's forgettable, she lacks depth, and so on. I'm curious if any of you guys have had similar discussions in your groups, because it is of course purely my personal experience. Nevertheless, it's an interesting observation as it stands in complete contrast to the overwhelming popularity of Y'shtola by both the developers and the community. As such, a good portion of this video will be dedicated to examining where these two opposing views come from. I will additionally talk about her role in the story as well as some key moments for her character and go into some of her personality and character traits, so this video should be a lot of fun. Right, so let's start off with the notion of her character lacking any depth, being unable to connect to the character or seeing her as forgettable. The main reason for this is that out of the main cast, Y'shtola is a bit of an exception in terms of how her character is fleshed out. The Warrior of Light has a flat character arc, which is to be expected from a blank slate character, and the other 6 from the main cast undergo a change arc, leaving Y'shtola, who undergoes neither of those things. Now, this might be painfully obvious to some, but I just want to make sure we are all on the same page. When people talk about character development or a character arc, they most often refer to a change arc or a transformation or whatever you want to call it. This is basically the classic hero's journey where a character goes through a very drastic transformation to the point that if you were to examine how they were at the start and at the end of the story, they would essentially be two entirely different characters. However, there are more types of character arcs than simply change arcs. For instance, in my Xenos video, I discussed what a flat character arc is like. When it comes to Y'shtola, all of her major development has already happened by the time the game starts. Matoya, being her teacher, developed much of her personality and quirks. Ida was important in fleshing out her social skills due to her being a cave hermit most of her childhood, and Luizua made her connected to the group she would end up with, that group being the Scions, and helped in giving her a purpose. This has all already happened by the time we meet her in the game. Y'shtola is a very well-rounded character with seemingly few flaws, or at least in contrast to many of the other characters. On top of this, the writers deliberately chose to not give her a fall and something huge to overcome. She doesn't have to overcome a traumatic experience, she doesn't have childhood scars, she doesn't get abused by other characters, she has no moral dilemmas, she doesn't have to make super difficult choices, she doesn't get tempted or forced to sway from her chosen course, nor does she suffer from any sort of a mental illness, so on and so forth. This, again, being in big contrast to the rest of the main cast. Do note the word deliberate, because I do very much believe she was written this way on purpose, which I'll get to later. Also note that this does not mean she doesn't deal with hardships. I simply mean to say that she doesn't have a fall or a huge conflict that would cause her to change in some drastic way via overcoming that adversity. When it comes to Y'shtola, her character arc is more of a growth arc as opposed to a change arc. Alternatively, you could say that she grew but did not develop. The distinction here is that if a character at the end of a story is an improvement over what they were at the beginning, but are still at their core the exact same person as before, then they didn't go through a transformation, but they did grow. So from A Realm Reborn to Endwalker, we don't get a fully transformed Y'shtola, but simply Y'shtola 2.0. The reason I bring up this difference between a character going through a transformation versus them growing is that the reason some struggle to connect as much to Y'shtola is because she doesn't go through such a drastic formation as the rest of the cast. As a result, her character doesn't seemingly have as much depth, and so in a sense sticks out like a sore thumb. Though to say she has no depth whatsoever would be quite a bad take. The question is then, why write her this way? Why not give her the same treatment as we saw with the others, given how effective it is? The simplest answer is that the story required for Y'shtola to be written this way. But to answer this question a little more properly, all we need to do is take a look at Y'shtola's role in the narrative. The first thing is balance. It's a good thing to have the cast consist of characters with different types of arcs. While some of the characters might go through huge changes, it's nice to have a character like Y'shtola who is steadfast and doesn't alter much, bringing some stability into the main cast. Not to mention that she isn't young, immature or a lone wolf. Also, the way her character is written as a no-nonsense type of a scholar who is both pragmatic and smart allows her to serve as a reliable source of information to the Warrior of Light and thus the player, as opposed to the other characters who might say something that is either too big-brained, impulsive or uneducated. But the most important thing is the way in which she enhances the main character. Secondary characters enhancing the protagonist is quite a common thing, and FF14 is no different. All the Scions had these major flaws which served to empower the Warrior of Light, as those flaws were resolved in big part thanks to the Warrior of Light. But here we have an exception with Y'shtola. The virtues of the Warrior of Light do not affect her as much precisely because she had no such major flaw in the first place. What this does is basically offer a character that stands on a different footing. The other characters feel indebted to you, thus skewing the relationship a little. With Y'shtola though, the relationship between her and the Warrior of Light is that of equals, more or less. And when I say equal, I am not talking about combat capabilities or anything like that. I simply mean the amount that you relied on each other throughout the story. This is important because FF14, having an avatar as its protagonist, needs this type of a character because it gets tiring if everyone is extremely reliant on the super amazing Warrior of Light all the time. So to bring this back around, the reason some of my friends didn't enjoy Y'shtola is that she never underwent a huge transformation. This is rather understandable, but it's worth keeping in mind that this was very much intentional by the developers. It's not like they simply forgot to develop her. She gets so much screen time throughout the story, there would have been a million opportunities to do so, meaning her character is this way not because of a blunder, but by design. So please keep that in mind. Alright, so next we can address the other half. If Y'shtola doesn't undergo huge personal development like the other characters, why is she so popular and why is she, for all intents and purposes, the face of FF14? By which I mean that she is the poster girl of the game, the main indication of this being that she was the FF14 representative in Dissidia and often making appearances in marketing of the game. In a sense, she is what Cloud is to FF7. But in terms of narrative, it doesn't make much sense, since Alphinaud is the most important non-player character in the story, which you may recall being discussed in the Alphinaud video. So then why isn't Alphinaud the one to be in the spotlight? The answer to this lies in looking at past events like the Lightning Returns crossover and the 15 crossover. In both cases, FF14 is represented via a Miqo'te. Then consider that Dissidia and T came out the same year as Heavensward, so we know that Y'shtola was designated the mascot already during A Realm Reborn. Both of these facts basically point to Y'shtola being chosen as the representative of FF14 for strictly logistical reasons. She represented the most unique and most played FF14 race at the time, and by her being the most relevant cat girl, she got the gig, not due to her being the most important in the story, but due to her being the most recognizable. And this isn't really anything new. Those of you who played FF12 might be familiar with a similar scenario, where the devs of that game have come out and bluntly stated that Vaan was simply a last-minute addition purely for marketing reasons, as they felt an old protagonist wasn't good for sales. We don't know for sure, but it's possible that Y'shtola may have been created with a similar mindset. Of course, some people might disagree with a character existing purely for marketing reasons instead of a narrative reason, but it's worth mentioning that Y'shtola adds way more to the story than Vaan, so even if that was the case, it definitely doesn't show in FF14 like it did in 12. Okay, so that answers why she's fit for marketing, but what about her popularity? This too has a rather straightforward answer, although keep in mind that, as far as I've understood, Y'shtola is way more popular in Japan than she is here in the West. Just something little to keep in mind when we talk about just how popular this character is. Anyway, the reason for her popularity is that she is the most appealing option for people attracted to women, which I would wager is the majority of the player base. Other female characters are either antagonistic, Lalafels, underaged, or Lees. Now, this isn't to say that she's a good character simply because she's a hot mommy cat girl plus booba, but it is most likely the primary reason. I know these reasons I stated may seem painfully obvious, but I'm bringing them up to emphasize that there are pretty concrete and easy to grasp reasons behind Y'shtola's success, and that I don't recommend reading much more into it. Now that we've laid some groundwork, we can get into more specific aspects of her character, and what more fitting way to start off than by addressing the elephant in the room, Y'shtola's plot armor. I discussed this quite extensively in my Tancred analysis, so I recommend checking that out if you're interested in more discussion related to this, but FF14 is rather committed to pulling off the common JRPG trope where a character seemingly dies only to go, psych, they back. This tendency to do fake-out deaths pretty much reaches its peak when it comes to Y'shtola. The number can vary depending on your interpretation, but it can be as high as 4 fake-outs when it's all added up. Wow, that is quite impressive. I think the only game I've played where a character dies more is Bloodborne. So naturally this creates a dissonance among some players because, yeah, some people don't appreciate a character who has a ton of plot armor, and trust me, Y'shtola's plot armor is thicker than a bank vault. The reason they keep faking out her death in just about every expansion is simply that in each of those scenarios, she was the character that it made the most sense to do it with. In Shadowbringers, it was to serve Emmet Selk's character. In Stormblood, it was because they wanted to give the spotlight to other characters, so they wrote her out right at the beginning. In A Realm Reborn/Heavensward, I'll talk about that when we get to her attributes. Now, some people see this usage of fake character deaths as a crutch, and rightly so, but look on the bright side. You only need to kill her off 5 more times and she might actually die for good. As usual, I want to dedicate a segment talking about the character's personality and their character traits. Certainly the most distinct feature of Y'shtola is her no-nonsense attitude. She has a low tolerance for BS, whether it comes from her allies or otherwise. BS in this case being indicated by something that she deems foolish. This gives her a rather outwardly cold demeanor, which acts as a double-edged sword of sorts. Some people will love this kind of a character, since it's nice to have someone blunt in the group, but it can also easily irritate someone, as she can be seen as quite rude at times. Just to give a few examples of this quirk in action, the first big one was in patch 2.2 when she calls out Admiral Merylweb on their conflict with the Sahagin and Kobold, breeding this cycle of violence and retribution which necessitates constant primal summoning. This kinda makes us cheer for Y'shtola because we, as the outside view, see how racist the Eorzeans are towards the beast tribes. So yeah, it's easy to take her side on this, even though we understand that it's not something that the Admiral can just magically fix. Another major one is in Shadowbringers, where Y'shtola poked Tancred and struck a nerve, as well as her being irritated with Gratia and Urianger, even acting a tiny bit antagonistic towards them due to the way they appear to be carefree about using the warrior flight and endangering them for their plan in their efforts to hide their full intentions. This is actually quite understandable though, as in the case of Tancred, we as the players also most likely have grown a little tense of the way he's projecting, and in the case of Grahatia and Urianger, well, would you not be a little pissed if your comrades were leaving you out of the loop like that? This kind of a conflict within the main cast is interesting, but as I said, can also be dangerous because a player can just as easily end up hating Y'shtola for it, even if her opposing the other characters is justified. I also want to mention that this kind of an attitude isn't always necessarily painted as a positive trait in the story, and in fact, it's really up to interpretation whether you consider it a character flaw or not. Besides the fact that she's got no chill, Y'shtola is known for her sassy remarks. Of course, Alice and sometimes Cryon also deliver these remarks, but Y'shtola's delivery tends to be more mature, laser accurate, and most importantly, Y'shtola brings with her some dry humor, which I honestly enjoy quite a lot, especially with how Robin Addison really brings that out of the character.
She's actually a side of me that I didn't realise needed to come out. She is great at decision making, which is something I'm terrible at, so it's quite refreshing to play someone who's so direct but then can have moments of like wry humour come through, and I really, really feel quite powerful when I'm playing her. Brings out quite a fun side. I think she's incredibly intelligent and has this superiority, this innate superiority and presence about her that is just really, I really enjoy trying to channel that. Yeah.
Now, as I mentioned at the start of the video, Y'shtola is also recognized for her wisdom. She is very much someone who isn't satisfied with simply accepting facts as they are, so to speak, and is always looking to improve her understanding of the world beyond that which one sees on the surface. This is also the biggest drive for her character, and indeed you can often see Y'shtola talk about uncovering the secrets that lie beneath the star, or about opportunities to seek out more knowledge, or wishing she'd have more time to investigate certain things on your journey, and so on. This makes for a nice contrast to Alphino, who uses his wit in an attempt to make the world a better place, while Y'shtola learns more about the world so that she herself can understand it better. And though I do feel like Alphino was a case of writing a smart character better, I do think the writers did a decent job at portraying Y'shtola being intelligent. For instance, an optional piece of background dialogue in Shadowbringers that summarizes Y'shtola's character quite well is when you visit Raktika for the first time, and Urianger mentions that she went through the entire library in the Crystarium pretty quick before she moved to other sources of information. I mean, do you remember how many books are in that place? She also has brilliant deduction skills which are often brought up, just to mention a few examples. Figuring out the connection between the burn, the device in Azim's Step, and Aziz's Line 4.4. Figuring out before you even visit Amaroth that the structures in the Tempest were from unsundered times, and that these kinds of structures would only appear in a reflection like the first, due to all the calamities in the source having likely wiped out such remnants. Figuring out the true nature of the Echo before Elidibus fully reveals it to us. Realizing that Elidibus is a primal, or realizing why Hydaelyn sundered everyone, so they'd rely less on ether and more on dynamis. These are just to mention a few examples where her intelligence is on display quite nicely. This might sound like a redundant point to make, but it really isn't always the case. Writing smart characters is hard because generally it's limited by the wit of the writer themselves, and you gotta do it right with no BS to trick the audience. So I give props to the writers that can do it properly, even if, again, I feel like they did it better with certain other characters like Alphino. This never-ending quest of knowledge also pairs quite nicely with her tenacious nature. I alluded to this earlier in the video, where Y'shtola's lack of change arc allows her to be that kind of a steadfast character, and this unwavering conviction serves as something of a pillar. Whereas other characters might be in constant flux, you know that Y'shtola always has that super strong focus. Finally, the main unique trait that makes Y'shtola stand out is of course her blindness, as a result of her casting Flow and being yeeted into the livestream. Matoya mentions that her using Ether to see is draining her life force and that she would die quicker as a result, implying that there are consequences to using it. This would be nice because it would make for a nice consequence for her action of using Flow. The problem, however, is that this point is dropped basically immediately. It's never brought up again by Matoya or any other character, nor does it affect Y'shtola in any way throughout the story. Sure, we can infer that, oh, she's going to die quicker, and it's so indicative of her character that she chooses to keep searching for knowledge despite it burning her own life. But let's be honest, we don't really give a shit if we don't see any tangible consequences in the actual story itself. Contrast this to Tancred, whose consequences from the very same spell are much better implemented. Additionally, the effects of Y'shtola's blindness have caused some confusion in the past. I've seen people ask things such as, how is she able to read super old murals but unable to see the night sky in Shadowbringers? Or in Endwalker, she states that she can't see creatures transformed by the final days, yet in Vanaspati, when fighting against them as a trust member, she can fling spells at them just fine. Another good one was when, in the process of making this video, I had someone ask, how does she read books? There are situations like this where the player might ask, hold on, how does she see X? You can then cook something up on the spot that kinda makes sense, but we aren't fully sure, so you kinda just hand wave it. That is to say, how exactly this ability works isn't very well defined. Now, before someone comes in correcting me, yes, there is ether in everything in the FF14 world, so the ability makes sense in concept. I'm just saying that there is something about the execution of this trait that makes it unclear to a lot of people, and you can really easily find proof of this. Literally just Google search Y'shtola's blindness or whatever keywords you wanna use, and you'll see tons and tons of threads of people being confused about how the ability works. This to me is a clear indication that the functionality of this attribute isn't as readily apparent as the writers were potentially hoping. Another sour point about Y'shtola's blindness is that it doesn't seem to have that much bearing on the story, nor does it really seem to have an impact on the character itself. This is what is sometimes referred to as an informed flaw, which is when we are told that a character has a flaw, but it barely has any effect on them, if at all. However, while I do think her blindness is severely underutilized, I do want to defend the writers a bit here. First of all, remember those dumb-looking ether goggles that the Scions wore in A Realm Reborn? Yeah, glad you haven't seen them in a while, huh? Well, the reason you haven't seen them in a long time is because Y'shtola being blind overrides the need for them. This is one tangible benefit of her blindness. The other is that while it does rarely come into play, they did use it to flesh out her character a bit later on, especially in Endwalker, which I'll touch on later. I also want to mention that just as with Tancred, this is baked into gameplay for when you bring her into a dungeon as a trust member. So when you are doing a dungeon with her in your party, she reacts to mechanics faster than other party members, often before they even begin. Hello, this is me from Post. Just wanna say something to my dumbass past self, cause I must have had some serious brain lag when I said that. So all the party members do react before the mechanic begins. However, in some specific instances, Ustola will react ever so slightly faster. She is also the only trust member in the Heidelin fight who does not get hit by a mechanic, which is deliberate. This brings an interesting advantage if you bring Ustola, and it helps sell her role as that sort of a mentor and powerful sorceress, but it's also a nice gameplay story integration, since her unique sight allows her to react to mechanics faster, so it makes a lot of sense. It's a little backwards, but it seems like the writers intended Ustola's blindness to be more of a boon than a negative consequence to her character, which, when you look at it from that angle, it does sound way more sensible. All in all, I do think the writers have kinda slept on her blindness trait, but I don't think it's the worst thing in the world.
You mean to tell me you went gallivanting about using my name and only bother to visit when you need a favor? And don't pretend you don't. I taught you long enough.
Alright, let's talk about Matoya. Now, Matoya is awesome.
Oh, is that trouble I smell? Or did you forget to wipe your boots on the way in? Come to disturb my peace again, have you? I hide myself away in a cave, and still you people insist on pestering me with your problems. Oh, I mistook you for young what's-his-name, but I see now you're the sister. Weren't you supposed to be the lively one? I've seen happier faces at a rain-sodden burial. Ha! That's more like it. Stoller used to spit and hiss like a wildcat too. Better for a young thing like you to be filled with fire and leave the doom and gloom to your elders. Do you have a bad back or something? At ease, boy. Whatever mess you've made, I'm not in the habit of dwelling on the failings of the younger generation.
I like her a lot, what can I say? Not only is it a sweet nostalgia trip with the cave, the brooms that speak backwards, the remixed song, hell, they even had her have a crystal ball, but instead of Matoya herself being blind, it's her student. But more than that, Matoya fills a nice role in the story. It's the classic FF story where you got the previous generation of accomplished old-timers and the party that follows in their footsteps, Galuf, Luizua, and Matoya. These three legendary archons being connected not just by their greatness, but by their rivalry to one another, and through all of them having a distinct distaste for Charlean antiques, but most importantly, by their connection to our party members throughout the game. Galuf and his adopted grandchild Cryon, Luizua and his grandchildren Alize and Alfino, and of course Matoya, who raised Ustola. The thought of these three incredible sages in their prime invokes a certain type of wonder and mystique, and you can tell that Matoya really cared about those two with the way she brings them up in regards to both Cryon and Alfino. But then we also have the sad aspect of it, that all this greatness comes from a now bygone era. This is perfectly encapsulated by Matoya's theme, which has a rather somber tone as opposed to the upbeat original version of the song. What's really cool here is that Mr. Soken essentially simply halved the tempo of the song and made it sound more poignant so that it better fits into FF14. See, in FF1, visiting the cave is a sort of an adventure, as is most of FF1, but in FF14, we are given an entirely different atmosphere, the story of an old woman who made entire breakthroughs in her field in her prime, but who now stands secluded in a cave, too stubborn to leave, and with a strong distaste for her homeland, whose colleagues are dead and she's waiting to join them. There's an awesome side story in the hinterlands that really elaborates on Matoya, which I highly recommend doing if you haven't already. I'm just gonna read out these few lines cause I think they're perfect as they are. Well, I'm sorry, but I've got no desires, none at all. Nay, there's naught left of me but my pride. I poured my heart and soul into my research. Passionate as I was, I invariably clashed with those around me. But even as these clashes served to stoke the fires of my motivation, they walled me off from the rest of the world. And here I am. This cave is my home now, but ere long it will become my tomb. I'll die and turn into bones amidst this gloom, and none will be the wiser. There's nothing I desire. I am just an old woman awaiting death. No, my mistress, you are great and wise. You deserve better than that. If you will but give the command, I shall make your accomplishments known to the world, that your name might be remembered for all time. If I desired such things, I wouldn't have hidden myself here. If someone wants my knowledge, they'll have to find my cave and force open the door and survive the attentions of my minions. This mentality is understandable. Matoya got really screwed over by what she deems Charlian cowardice, aka their decision to abandon the Dravanian colony. It's quite easy to relate to how Matoya could remain so bitter for 15 years, especially given that she never got along with Charlians in the first place. But what this side quest also does is that it emphasizes the powerful bond between Matoya and Y'shtola. We find out that Matoya has kept around memories of her time with Y'shtola in a broom, and then she wishes to be buried alongside said broom. It's rather touching that the most important thing she deems, the thing that she wants to be buried alongside with, isn't her research, her life's work, or any of her other accomplishments. No, it's the memories of a young Y'shtola. This is reinforced by the way she shows this tough love affection to Y'shtola, and at times her exterior even cracks a bit, like in that side quest or when she warns her of her life being drained. For Matoya, Y'shtola is the only thing remaining in this world that gives her joy, and for Y'shtola, Matoya is her role model and something she aspires to be. And I think that's something the writers nailed really well. When you look at Y'shtola, you see someone with basically identical behavior and worldviews to Matoya. Hell, they even share some character traits like their distaste towards Charlian. The only real difference between them is that Matoya is way more harsh than Y'shtola, which makes sense given that bitterness I mentioned. Y'shtola is sassy for sure, but Matoya has a downright acerbic tongue. She is also way more blunt, to the point that at one point even Y'shtola is like, was that really necessary? Anyway, I really like the mentor-student relationship of these two, and I do think that the inclusion of Matoya was the best thing they did in regards to Y'shtola's character.
The path you've chosen is paved with the dead. Walk it with your eyes open, or not at all.
Alright, this last segment will be discussing what they did with the character in the last two expansions. I am starting with Shadowbringers because honestly there isn't anything exciting to note about Y'shtola pre 5.0 besides the things I already discussed. Now, the moment you enter the Raktika Great Woods, you are overwhelmed with this aura of there being this ancient historical significance to this place, which then of course makes you think of Y'shtola and her desire to discover the truths behind this star. What a fitting location to tie this character to. Y'shtola has spent about 3 years in the first by the time you get there, and has spent most of that time becoming a leading figure for the Knights Blessed, who would have been doomed without her guidance. This is already a pretty cool setup, but before we discuss it, it would be prudent to mention her outfit and job change in Shadowbringers. I think just about anyone can agree that this was a brilliant move, having her go from a healer to a full-on badass black mage. Of course, as I explained in my black mage video, She isn't exactly a black mage due to lacking a gem of Shatodo and being unable to use any spells from the black school of magic. In this sense, she really is more of a boosted thaumaturge. But an interesting thing to note is that she is the closest to a real black mage from the Final Fantasy series, more so than the actual black mages in this game. This is because black magic typically includes all or nearly all 6 of the elements. This was the case in 1.0, but in A Realm Reborn they had to change it to where it was split between black and white magic, or thaumaturgy and conjury. Y'shtola does use all 6 elements though, so you could say she's the OG black mage, funnily enough. Then we have the outfit. Combined with the design of the outfit itself and the way it was revealed to us, as well as the job change associated with it, I would say that this is my favorite outfit from any character in this game. And that's not something to say lightly, given how many amazing ones there are. Her outfit is so freaking cool. Huge props to Ayumi Namae. This outfit change is accompanied by Y'shtola becoming less cool-headed and a bit more sociable in Shadowbringers. To use her own words, she cultivated an image of restraint, as in, she lost a bit of her sassy nature. This is more or less a direct result of having to be in that leadership position and getting close to the people of Slitherbow. She basically goes from being a sassy cat without filter to someone with a bit more restraint, but still stern. And this is explored with the relationship between her and Runar in particular. You know, originally when I finished Shadowbringers, I was a bit sour about the whole Master Matoya debate in the trailer, because it got everyone speculating, oh, what could this mean? Only for it to turn out to be basically nothing. So it kinda felt like it was a pure marketing thing to hype up the player base and spark discussion. But now that the whole story has concluded, I kinda like the fact that she called herself Matoya in the first. Not only does it add a very strong sign that she's walking in Matoya's footsteps, that whole role model thing I mentioned, but it also works wonderfully because of the mentor-student relationship she has with Runar. The reason she is so fond of him is because Runar's enthusiasm reminds her of herself when she was younger and under Matoya's tutelage. So it's quite fitting how she's playing the role of Matoya while being called Master Matoya. And besides, I found these two to be quite endearing. But as nice as Shadowbringers was, I feel like Endwalker is the expansion where Y'shtola really gets to shine. First of all, we got the Daphnair segment, and this was more than anything an awesome usage of Y'shtola's blindness attribute. If you didn't do this dungeon with Y'shtola, you really missed out. It makes for great foreshadowing for what's about to happen, but it also shows us the kind of an emotional state that Y'shtola is in throughout the dungeon. When the children get turned, she notes the dissipation of ether, and as the dungeon goes on, she becomes less and less talkative, to the point that after the second boss, she is legit unable to form words. Because you have to imagine this from her point of view. She's watching living beings going from 100 to 0 in an instant. Think about how horrifying that would be. So yeah, after the second boss, she is literally out of words. Y'shtola, of all people. And she will say nothing for the rest of the dungeon, even when you approach her after defeating the last boss. And then you get the reveal in the cutscene after the dungeon. This was such a powerful scene, and you really feel the desperation in her voice.
I saw nothing. Not the blasphemy that perished here, nor the other men turned beasts. And because of this, I now see all too well. There is no ether. Where the creatures should be, I saw naught but emptiness.
Emptiness? But that would mean...
Recall the words of the Watcher. 'Twas a stagnancy of ether, a cessation of flow, leading to decay and absence, that led the ancients to conclude their star was dying. This is the same phenomenon. The instant these people are seized by the transformation, their ether begins to rot and crumble away like dried mud. Until, from their corporeal forms to their very souls, naught remains.
But the beast spoke with its dying breath. Surely at least a sliver of the man it was endured.
Mayhaps so. But even if the process was incomplete, it was little more than a faint residue.
Gods be good. You're saying they cannot be saved?
Not by any means known to me. Or by any means at all, like as not. For there is naught left to save.
This moment is so impactful precisely because it's Y'shtola, that one person who was always steadfast, who is now wavering because the situation is so messed up. Such a horrible scene. I should also note that throughout Shadowbringers and Endwalker, Y'shtola's stern exterior starts to crack a bit, as we get to see a side of her that's a bit more vulnerable, so to speak. This scene has it on display the most prominently, but it's not the only time. For instance, Endwalker is the first time that Y'shtola is open with her feelings towards the warrior of light. And no, I'm not talking about romantic feelings. I refer to her being worried for and looking after them. Now, this has always been the case. We clearly see that, especially in Shadowbringers, but it's just that she was never as upfront about it as the other characters. This makes sense, since as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, she isn't indebted to the warrior of light, hence she doesn't feel the need to constantly bring it up. But it is also a part of her personality. She just doesn't feel the need to keep expressing her worry and appreciation all the time. But this scene is great precisely because she finally gets to openly say that yes, she's worried and wants us to make it through this. Another strong moment is with the Ea in Ultima Thule. The Ea represent the pinnacle of scientific/technological innovation and intelligence to the point where they can come to a conclusion about the end of the world, said conclusion being the end of the universe via an inevitable heat death. And so they conclude that life is pointless, since it'll all go down the drain eventually. I love Y'shtola's reply here, because she essentially goes, I don't care, I will continue my quest for knowledge anyway. Because it was never the knowledge itself, but rather the journey and search for it, and gaining her own truth that drove her forwards. So she basically doesn't care that the Ea think the world will end this way. They also do something cool here. See, whenever Y'shtola poses a theory, she explicitly mentions that it's just an idea and to take it with a grain of salt. But here the Ea are pressing their theory as fact, so it makes sense that she would react negatively, since it goes against her own principles to stop at a partial truth and go around stating it as an actual truth. Because that partial truth may as well be no truth at all, and we as players can easily side with her on this because she's absolutely right. Finally, we have the last conversation with her, where she talks about writing everything down. I like this because it's another cool parallel between her and Matoya. They both lack a desire to publicize their work due to their principles and stubbornness. Only Y'shtola here does entertain the idea out of consideration for people in the future who, like her, seek that knowledge. It's interesting that you can answer yes or no. Something I do want to share that I found quite amusing is that I had to search high and low to find out what she says in the second option. I'm not kidding, I went through like 20 streams of people playing through the story and asked about it on 3 different Discords. The best I got was a streamer who was considering it for a second, but went with the first option in the end, and someone who responded to my post saying they did pick the second option, but had forgotten the response by now. In the end, I got the answer on Gamerscape, but wow, kind of crazy that no one picked that option. But if you think about it, it's fitting that I had to go through such a quest for that bit of knowledge, given the character that we're talking about. Anyway, if you answer no, she will actually refrain from publishing any formal work on the Ea or the Ancients or on any of the wonders we encountered, only writing down some notes so that she doesn't forget certain things. As such, because it's choice dependent, there most likely won't be an outcome to this conversation at any point. So if you were hoping to see the book, tough luck, but ultimately it doesn't matter. The point is that by way of her at least considering it, she's already on the path towards diverging from her mentor. This matters because in Matoya we have a living, breathing example of what can happen if your ambition starts to taper off. If Y'shtola has this drive to care a bit about her work, it will help prevent her from becoming like Matoya, someone who is mostly devoid of any motivation in her old age. That is of course assuming she will ever reach that age, because of her burning her life away to sea, which is kinda bleak, but then again we are playing FF14. There were a lot of points scattered throughout this video, so let me just bring it all together here at the end. Y'shtola is the only character from the main cast that doesn't go through a transformation, which gives this illusion that she lacks the amount of depth that the others do. Though fake-out deaths are a common thing in this game, Y'shtola holds the record. She plays a key role in the story as a steadfast and reliable, almost a mentor figure of sorts, and as someone who is the least reliant on the warrior of light, as well as rendering those stupid ether goggles obsolete, even if arguably her blindness may have been a little underutilized overall. She has a strong personality and plenty of quirks, and has a great student-mentor relationship with Matoya. Y'shtola's popularity may vary depending on if you are in Japan or in the West. Finally, due to being the most prominent cat girl, she is the face of FF14 and will most likely remain as such for the foreseeable future. All in all, a great character. So great, in fact, that one could say Y'shtola rules the story. That really came out cheesier than I thought, I'm sorry. Anyway, that's been all for this time. Feel free to check out the other characters from the Endwalker main cast, and if you enjoy listening to this type of discussion, subscribing to this channel is an easy way to stick around. Have a nice day!